its wildlife economy, and how it possibly can go further in diversifying itself and really contributing to a flourishing wildlife economy. I'm speaking on behalf of AWEI, African Wildlife Economy Institute. As most of you already know us, this is clear, but for those who don't, we are a research think tank and engagement institute based at Stellenbosch University, and we are really pursuing a vision that looks to see landscapes across the continent of Africa through thriving wildlife economies being able to contribute simultaneously to wildlife conservation, climate resilience, inclusive economic opportunity, and social well-being. This is our vision, and how we try to think about that is across the lenses of what does it take to make that happen? Well, on the one side, to make that happen, you have to have an enabling environment. You have to have policies, regulations, laws, international trade agreements, everything that is outside the economy itself, that exists surrounding it, that makes it possible for this to happen. And on the other side, of course, is you have to have that economy itself to thrive. What does it take in terms of identifying markets, production, how we look at how our actual conservation process itself can support an economy, how it actually works within itself to have the standards to make it credible in international markets and local markets, and how within itself it supports its communities and its broader economic opportunities. So that is what AWEI is about. And here today, we're at the sort of early stages of a process of looking at Zimbabwe. Given that the government there has decided to make a priority to look at the status of the biodiversity economy and how it can progress, we see that there is an enormous opportunity here for all of us. And this is what we at AWEI are trying to coordinate and find the research opportunities that need to be, the new research gaps that need to be filled, and need the engagement that needs to happen to create and engage in constructive ways to support that endeavor so that we can all contribute to the sustainable development of Zimbabwe. I just want to say that we're very grateful today to our partners and our major funders, Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation, who also have some interesting experiments going on and activities in Zimbabwe that work on this, but who really have made it possible for AWEI to engage in these efforts. And of course, we're mostly very, very grateful to all of you who obviously think that this is important and worthwhile doing, and with whom we would like to see an ongoing partnership, not just coming today to listen here and engage in a discussion, but to engage with us at AWEI ongoing into the future so that we can all make this positive contribution. So, although, as I said, AWEI is about continent-wide, and we have this continent-wide vision, we're here to try to see how we can support this process in Zimbabwe particularly. I'm very sorry that today Frank is not here because he should be doing what I'm doing now, but he's hopefully on his way home. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that we have had enormous interest in this meeting, and we hope to be able to engage with everybody's questions. Please put them into the chat as they arise, and we'll do our best. But we do realize that it might not be possible to engage as fully as we would like to. So in that respect, please feel free, send us emails, put your questions in the chat, and we will treat this as an ongoing conversation. It is an exploratory blue sky brainstorming session, and we'd like to continue it. Right, so today we have a pretty good panel here, even if I say so myself, of some very interesting people who will be able to help us set the stage and really start us thinking about how the economy can diversify. Each one of them brings in a particular perspective and experience that I hope will stimulate all of us to think about these things. Our first speaker will be Victor Muposhi, who is a member of the Conservation Leadership Faculty at ALU, the African Leadership University, and with whom we collaborate closely, their School of Wildlife Conservation. He's also an associate professor in wildlife management at the Botswana University of Agriculture and Natural Resources. And of course, he is one of AWEI's research fellows, where he is exploring wildlife economy innovations in Eastern and Southern Africa. So he will set the stage because ALU has done some magnificent work of research led by Sue Snyman in looking at wildlife economies in Africa. And that broad range research has helped to take us to that broader look. And so Victor will bring forward his learnings and his perspectives from that. We're then having Roseline Mandisodza-Chikerema. Now, Rose is a wildlife ecologist at Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority. She's also an AWEI research fellow and is taking her research further into at the PhD level. She will talk about the animal aspects and wildlife ranching and how, so really getting down into that sector and seeing how can that operate more broadly, offer more opportunities, and what is it going to take to make that happen. Third, we will have Caroline Jacquet. And Caroline is the project manager at Bioinnovation Zimbabwe, where she works on commercializing neglected and underutilized indigenous plants. This is also an important area that we sometimes forget, is that when we have a landscape, to turn that landscape into a really thriving wildlife economy means that we have to look not just at the animals, but also at plants, which are very, very important in several ways. There's non-timber forest products, there's wild harvesting of indigenous plants that can really contribute to thriving economies. There's, of course, bioinnovation, all that kind of thing. So that's broad. And then finally, we're going to ask Tariro to help us take Tariro Kamuti, who is also an AWEI research fellow, and a fellow at the University of Cape Town's Global Risk Governance Program. And Tariro is going to help us understand and stimulate thinking about the sort of complex systems dynamic of a wildlife economy and how we can really think across, as we said, animals, plants, carbon, bugs, everything, to really see how these different elements of an economy can be stimulated together to create a really thriving wildlife economy. So we're looking forward to some exciting ideas coming up. We're looking forward to your comments and considerations of this, and we're looking forward to engaging. I'm now going to just hand over to Victor to start. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and welcome everyone in the call. I'm happy to be a panelist to talk about one or two things that I have appreciated and learned from the ongoing state of wildlife economy in Africa, research that is being conducted by Dr. Snyman and team, and tapping into my experiences and observations over the years on what could be a potential game changer in terms of conservation and contributing to the GDP of African countries. If we are to take the wildlife economy or biodiversity economy seriously, in many cases, looking my background and the people that I've interacted with, people always question and talk about hunting being the only thing in wildlife that can bring in money, and very few people talk about tourism and ranching, bioprospecting, carbon, and other activities, non-timber forestry products. Very few people talk about those things. And because of that, we tend to then lose focus on the bigger picture of what the wildlife economy is really all about. And I think in my short submission, I would like to say, if you miss everything that I'm going to say after a few moments from now, do not miss these few observations of mine and something that I think everyone in this room should think and consider. Personally, I'm happy to to be associated with everyone and movements and, oh, let me not be political about using the word movement, but people who want to support and promote sustainable, equitable, and inclusive conservation. We might lose focus and talk about many other things, but when it comes to the wildlife economy, it is there to offer us a solid opportunity to promote sustainable, equitable, and inclusive conservation, without which the tail of conservation is something else. And so for that reason, we must make sure that through the conversations that we have when it comes to the wildlife economy, they should push for a transformational shift in the policy at local and national or regional level. But essentially for that to happen, the government and its citizens are supposed to be convinced that the risk of inaction outweighs the cost, without which there won't be any action. And so it is our role and it is our responsibility, those who are enlightened, to ensure that we make sure that the citizens, the people, and those who are in government are convinced that the risks of not engaging and promoting sustainable, equitable, and inclusive conservation of inaction will outweigh the cost. And therefore, there won't be any intergenerational equity. And with that, allow me then to say, if we look at the Wildlife Economy Report broadly, from my understanding as a Zimbabwean, it gives us a snapshot of what could be possible in each and every country in Africa if we tap into the natural capital that we have as a continent. And as Zimbabwe, looking at the protected area network system in Zimbabwe alone, you have great potential. Why? Because Zimbabwe's protected area network system covers almost 13% of the whole country. That's enormous. Add that to the community conserved areas that are there, and the conservancies, and the private game farms, and everything. That's enormous. And what that means is that we have an enormous untapped opportunity that we can actually take advantage of. But it takes you and me, all stakeholders involved, to appreciate and understand the significance of understanding what the wildlife economy is. And from that report, my takeaway message again is that they give us a clear indication of what they term as the big five, and of which many people, when we talk of the big five, they think, oh, now we are talking about elephants, rhino, buffalo, lion, and leopard. And no, we are talking about the big five in wildlife economy. And they have set a pace in the sense that they what can I say? They are championing and providing nomenclature and content to what all of us can tap into as we develop our national biodiversity or wildlife economy action plans or whatever programs. And in this concept, they talk about the big five in the sense of ecotourism, in the sense of hunting, in the sense of ranching, non-timber forestry products, and other activities or extractive or sustainable use activities, including bioprospecting, and then carbon markets. So broadly, this is what we are considering as the wildlife economy or biodiversity economy. That's how broad it is. And so if you then look at Zimbabwe as a country, the opportunities that I've indicated and talked about on the basis of the area or total area under or considered under conservation, that give us an essence of how we can take advantage and grow the economy from a wildlife economy perspective. Why? Because of the intricacy or the linkages that are existing between the wildlife economy and all the other sectors of the economy. And so if you talk about agriculture, you then cannot then negate the concept of conservation, because conservation makes agriculture thrive more. If we don't talk about pollination and everything, it means that partly agriculture is affected. But most ministries of agriculture, they deal with issues to do with domestication. They deal with issues to do with harvesting. They deal with a whole lot of other things. So if you look into that report as well, Zimbabwe can actually tap into this, because you notice that it is mostly an agro-based economy. But if you then look at it, Zimbabwe can actually not be considered as an agro-based economy on the basis of the potential of wildlife economy. That the wildlife economy has great potential in the sense that if the tourism is promoted and marketed, charity begins at home. Before we start to talk about people coming from the region, us as Zimbabweans, we need to be able to appreciate what we have, the potential that we have, because I cannot be an ambassador if I do not know Matusado. I cannot be an ambassador of Hwange National Park if I've never been there. But the more Zimbabweans and local people engage and talk about these national conservation areas or these potential tourism sites or ecotourism sites, no one will know about them. The more we talk about it, the more knowledgeable our colleagues become, etc., etc. And therefore, charity begins at home. It starts with me. It starts with you and me. And therefore, in this case, I want to submit and say, Deborah, that briefly, in terms of the wildlife economy in Zimbabwe, reflecting on what I have looked at the report on the state of wildlife economy in Africa, Zimbabwe has great potential. There are things that needs to be sorted out. And they can only be sorted out if we have conversations like this. Candid and very difficult conversations to talk about, but yet at the same time, very essential and critical for us to move forward. It is very important, and I hope in the conversations and colleagues who, and those who are participating will understand and appreciate that the wildlife economy is not only about hunting. Hunting is just that one fraction of the total package. And therefore, without being, toxic, without being raising polarity on the issues of the wildlife economy within the global conservation space, it should be understood that there are many solutions to one problem. And one solution can solve the problem that we have today. And for a more sustainable, equitable, and responsible conservation, I believe that if we support and promote ideologies around the wildlife economy or biodiversity economy, we should be able to tap into our natural capital and promote growth at domestic, regional, and contribute to the global economy. Thank you.
Well, Victor, thank you very much. That's a really powerful statement calling us to, I like the way you say charity begins at home, but what you really mean is discussion begins at home. And we should be having, as you said, those open and candid discussions and putting everything on the table and thinking how they work together. Now, everybody, I just want to say that Victor is not able to stay with us for the whole event today. So if anybody has a burning question, I mean, ideally, you know, we would go through all the presentations and then we would have discussion. But if anybody has a burning question for Victor, please raise it now, because I would like to have an opportunity, if anybody has something very specific they want to ask him, for them to raise it now. Victor, in the meanwhile, you know, you only touched on the question of agriculture and Zimbabwe's positioning as an agricultural economy. Do you and other people that are looking at wildlife economies see, and this is something I think I was going to ask Max maybe to comment on a bit later too, see how we can move forward to seeing agriculture within a wildlife economy context, whatever that means? Hybrid situations, conservation farming, biodiversity related farming, etc. Do you mean to have that kind of approach as part of the bigger discussion?
That would be interesting, Deborah, and thanks for raising that. Initially, when I started talking, I thought I would touch on that, but because of time, I didn't want to delve into that, because those are the contemporary conversations that I enjoy having these days. Why? Because if we come together and promote secular food systems, you know, and try to reform the way we're doing agriculture today, and then we are able to mainstream ecological practices that maintain biodiversity and our natural habitats, we should be able to have rich ecosystems that are able to then, you know, promote our own goals or our own ideals in terms of what is it that we need from the ecosystems through the various ecosystem services that we can have. And so that's number one, we need to reform our agricultural practices and make sure that we adopt more secular agri practices or food system approaches. That's number one. And then number two, it is becoming a common practice that when people talk of human and wildlife conflict, they are now trying to work towards human and wildlife coexistence, in the sense that instead of alienating people from the wildlife, which they never used to be, you know, historically they used to coexist, but it is because of unsustainable developmental practices that we cannot coexist anymore. And so there's persecution and there's loss of habitats, there's lots of species because of persecution, poaching, etc. But if we are more inclusive in our approaches and work towards coexistence, looking for innovations that promote coexistence and not alienation of each other, I mean, wildlife, natural spaces, and people, it then helps us to start having steps towards a new direction where there should be a more inclusive wildlife economy. Why? Because then we are looking at the bigger picture and doing things holistically. So that's one conversation that we need to talk about, and also look into research towards innovation approaches and practices that ensures the coexistence of wildlife and people, and therefore the promotion or maintenance of habitats, and then reduction of habitat loss and a minimization of poaching and persecution of wildlife.
Thanks so much, really, Victor. You've really put something down there that I think is clearly ripe for future thought and talk and development. Lynette, do you have a specific question for Victor on his presentation? Because I see also that there's another side discussion or two developing, but I really think we should, unless it's specific to Victor, we should move on with the other presentation so we can try to come back to those other issues. Lynette?
Okay, thanks very much. So this is Enos Shumba.
This is Lynette.
I work for WWF. I just wanted to acknowledge Victor's presentation, but I'm not going to be here for the rest of the day. This might touch on what Victor said, but also I think it's a recurrent theme. I like the focus which Victor has, but I'm just thinking about it in terms of the series. I think the economy, the biodiversity economy which Victor paints is very noble, but I think maybe it would be enriched, but as we go on, be enriched by the baselines, because most of what Victor is saying is already happening in this country. I hope as we move forward, we just sort of then putting the kind of the baselines so that we know, like tourism, there's a lot of it. If you look at agroecology, there's a lot of these things happening, tourism and how it's stumbling, the issue around ranching and things like that. So I think if we're going to have a very meaningful discussion, which I think is important, we need then to start baselining these against the realities which are prevailing in the country so that we can actually take it to the next level. So it's more of an observation in terms of our move. There are a number of organizations like mine doing quite a lot of work, parks. I know Africa Wildlife Foundation, they are doing this. I think it would be useful to build on rather than to kind of look at it from that level, then which is not grounded, and then it raises some kind of suspicion in terms of the depth of the discussion. So it's just like a comment and observation. It's useful that we have studied it, but it needs to be underpinned, it needs to be baselined so that we move forward. Over and thank you.
Super, thanks very much. Right, I'm going to park this other conversation about international influence and home influence and what the challenges are and how that's perspected till later. And I think we should move now to asking Rose, please, to talk about wildlife as animals. What can we do? What are the possibilities? Rose.
Thank you, Deborah, for the introduction and for coordinating this call. And I also want to thank Victor for giving us the baseline when talking of biodiversity economy. And as introduced by Deborah, my name is Roseline Mandisodza-Chikerema. I'm a wildlife ecologist with the Parks and Wildlife Management Authority. And today I'm part of this panel, and I'm going to talk about diversifying Zimbabwe's wildlife economy. And as highlighted earlier by Deborah, this is sort of coming in to tie in with the biodiversity economy blueprint, which the Ministry of Environment and African Wildlife Foundation are putting together for Zimbabwe. I'm sure you all know Zimbabwe is a country with lots of potential when it comes to wildlife. Wildlife has a potential to contribute to the economy of the country. With wildlife, we can sustain livelihoods at local level, at individual level, and also at community level. Wildlife in Zimbabwe is found inside and outside protected areas. We have wildlife on state protected areas, and we also have wildlife on private land, communal land, and on state land. And when looking at possible opportunities, we have several possible opportunities in which locals and also people can venture into and try and promote so that it can contribute to the economy of the country. When talking of wildlife ranching is mostly done outside on private land, communal land, or even on state land. And I'll start with examples of what has been going on. I'm sure you all know about the crocodile ranching. We have crocodile ranching that is being done on private land. And crocodile ranching is mostly being done for the meat and also for the skins. According to the UNEP CMC CITES database, Zimbabwe is a major exporter of crocodile meat and crocodile skins. And we can all build from this success as a country. With crocodiles, they used to be problem animals and they were almost extinct in the 80s, 90s. But with the introduction of intensive crocodile ranching, the collection of eggs from the wild, and when we started this, we would return 2% of the hatchlings, would put them back into the wild. But now we've had to stop that because we now have lots of crocodiles in the wild, and also the crocodile ranching as a business is really booming. So this is a great possible opportunity for people who could be interested. And we've also realized that with crocodile ranching, it contributes a lot to the national economy because most of this meat is exported and there is employment of locals in the crocodile ranching business. We also have ostrich farming on private land. Ostrich farming, it used to be one of our success stories until there were some disruptions in the 2000s, but this is one avenue with lots of potential. We breed ostriches for their leather, for meat, and also for their feathers. So this is one possible opportunity that contributes to the country's economy and also opens up, it also sustains livelihoods and creates employment for the locals. And we as the Parks and Wildlife Management Authority, we are also promoting ostrich farming. And looking at land, you know, with crocodile farming, this can be done under intensive management. And for an area from maybe 50 hectares to maybe even 100 hectares or bigger, because it's under intensive management, even a small piece of land can be utilized for ostrich farming. And other possible opportunity again is the keeping of plains game on private land, communal land, even on state land. And this can be done under intensive or extensive management. The possible species that can be bred is impala, we have the kudu, the zebra, blessbok, and even the wildebeest. And this can be done on very small areas under intensive management. And when you have this wildlife on your property, you can do a lot of activities. People can come in for consumptive and non-consumptive tourism, and also for photographic. And this is one avenue through which ecotourism can be done. And one other possible use again is wildlife education and awareness. People can come in, the locals can come in for education and also awareness so that we are able to conserve our wildlife as a country. Another possible opportunity when looking at economic opportunities in Zimbabwe under the wildlife sector is intensive breeding of high-value species. And on this, we are talking about the foot and mouth free disease, FMD-free buffaloes, and also the sables. These are high-value species that can be bred under intensive management and on private land. And in most cases, we are able to sell these buffaloes and also these sables. And with these, they can be sold locally, regionally, or even internationally. So this is another opportunity through which we can contribute to the economy of the country. And these animals can also be transferred from one property to another through for breeding purposes. And other species, again, that can be possible opportunities when looking at wildlife sector in the private, on private land, is the breeding of specially protected species. We have one success story of intensive breeding of the black and white rhino. We used to have the black and white rhino in the Zambezi Valley, but when there was intensive poaching and the populations were declining, we, as a country, we moved rhinos from the Zambezi Valley, and these were put into intensive protection zones on private land. And as of today, we used to have, I would say, less than 500, 300 rhinos in the late 80s, early 90s. But today, we are talking of rhinos that are now almost above 1,000 as a country. And this success is mostly attributed to the intensive protection of rhinos on private land. And when you have rhinos on private land, the major use for this, because rhinos are in Appendix 1, they cannot be hunted. The major use for rhinos in Zimbabwe is mostly for tourism purposes. People come and see rhinos, and they do rhino walks. And it's also a means for raising revenue on private land. When people come and visit, they pay to see these rhinos, and it contributes to the wildlife economy. It also sustains livelihoods. So this is one species which I can say has been successfully bred and managed on private land. So this is another opportunity again here in Zimbabwe. And we also have some specially protected antelopes like the Liechtenstein hartebeest and the roan antelope. These are species that can be sourced from the wildlife protected areas, the state areas, and these can be intensively managed on private land. And these contribute to the national economy through people coming in to see these animals, doing walks. And to also add on to that, when you have wildlife on private land, you can also build lodges and also build facilities where people can come for the weekends, for the holidays. They spend some time, they sleep, and also they get to appreciate wildlife. So wildlife in Zimbabwe plays a key role as it contributes to the national economy. So the major uses are mostly the consumptive, non-consumptive, which is also the photographic safari. We talk of ecotourism and wildlife and education and awareness. So these are the possible opportunities and the possible uses. And just to add on, all this is enabled through a permitting system. The Parks and Wildlife Management Authority has a permitting system which through a wildlife legislation and policy framework, it enables the keeping of game, the breeding of game, and also the capture and translocation of this wildlife. So at the moment, I would say we do have an environment that is there to allow for these possible opportunities in the wildlife sector. However, we have some challenges that we have, and I'm sure maybe it would be good also to mention firsthand is there are questions when it comes to the enabling environment. There's the issue of land tenure, and also the issue of wildlife diseases. I'm sure you know that here in Zimbabwe, we have the green zones where we are trying to promote the breeding and keeping of livestock like the cattle. And there are areas where you can have buffaloes, where you cannot. There are areas where you can have the wildebeest, the areas there where you cannot. So there are areas before you can venture, we need to look at where the area is located so that we also align with the requirements of the country. So I'm sure in a nutshell, Deborah, this is what I can present on the possible opportunities of the wildlife sector as it contributes to the economy of the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rose. That was a fantastic set of sort of very practical on the ground examples here. Crocodiles, ostrich, wildebeest. And I think that helps us to think in very, very practical terms of what the kinds of opportunities we could possibly have. I see that Peter is raising the question as to, this continuum between pure conservation and pure farming. I think, we have to think about how we manage it in between, but it all contributes to a panoply of opportunities. And I think this is a really good time now to switch to Caroline, who can talk about another perspective on a panoply of opportunities that were in quite specific terms. Caroline.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Caroline. I'm the project manager at an organization called Bioinnovation Zimbabwe. And as Deborah already indicated, at BIZ, we work on commercializing underutilized plants. And it's on behalf of these and other plants that I was asked to speak to you today. Because a wildlife economy is based on much more than just animals, of course. Plants can and should play a major role. There are nearly 6,000 different plant species in Zimbabwe, and about 20% of these have some commercial potential. Just for your information, less than 1% are currently commercialized. Local plants have so many benefits. I mean, they're often drought tolerant, they're resilient to the effects of climate change. They're often wild harvested, which means that, they're accessible to anyone and everyone interested. They're very suitable for poor people, women and youth, people that have less access to arable land. They can offer additional off-farm income during the off-season as well, because they don't clash with your more conventional field crops. And when given economic value, they can, of course, also contribute to better use and management of biodiversity. There are so very many different products that can be derived from plants, fruits, edible seeds, oil, both for cosmetic and also edible, the seed cake that can be used as livestock feed, the bark that can be turned into baskets, rugs, dyes, leaves of plants are often edible as well. And there's some intangible products as well, such as carbon sequestration offsets and tourism offerings. Just to give you an idea, the markets for these natural products are growing, and I'm just going to throw a few figures at you to show you that we're not talking of niche products here. The global market size of natural cosmetics and natural personal care products in 2019 was worth $50 billion. In that same year, 2019, the EU market size for anti-aging products, $15 billion. And the global market for superfoods, the figure for 2018 was $137 billion. And superfoods, the market for superfoods is projected to grow over the next 5 years with 8 to 9%. When we look at our very own local plant products, the current market, for example, for baobab oil and powder is between $50 and $75 million. It involves over 10,000 wild collectors, and in the SADC region, about 60 SMEs are involved in this industry. Current market for marula oil, $50 million. Current market for Kalahari melon seed oil, $10 million. That's just to give you an idea of some figures. We obviously are still facing very many challenges because all of these, markets and enterprises are only partially or often even very underdeveloped. There's very low consumer awareness, very low industry utilization. We also facing challenges with lack of scientific evidence, for example, when it comes to the cosmetic and nutritional values of a lot of these products. We're facing transport infrastructure challenges. Also, the producers or collectors, their capacity needs to be built, etc., etc. But just to put it in perspective, these challenges that we're facing with our own local plant products are very, very similar to the challenges that were faced by some very well-known oils, and I'm talking about shea and argan oil. When they started off, they were facing the exact same challenges that we're facing now. And the current market size for shea butter and oil at the moment is $1.7 billion US, and for argan oil, $1.5 billion. So just in short, I just wanted to put it out there that natural plant products have huge potential, sizable markets, but that obviously they will need to be given support by communities, by governments, by industry, and also by donors. And that's me done. I was told 5 minutes max.
No, Caroline, tell us more. Tell us more. That's really absolutely fascinating. Again, a set of very tangible opportunities that we can see that are there. And I think what's particularly interesting about what Caroline has said is, well, a couple of things. The one thing is the sheer size of these markets is quite staggering. So when we think about, the tens of billions that are in the cosmetics industry, or over 100 billion in the other one that she mentioned, this is, the superfoods. This is really telling us that there's something there, and it is possible to do this sustainably. It is possible to use, especially in the case of wild harvested indigenous plants, it is possible to have situations where there are significant inclusive economic opportunities, engagement with local communities in such a way that they are able to be part of this larger conservation initiative, where we can sustain the climate resilience of the country too in the face of climate change, as well as having those economic and social opportunities. I think what we're beginning to see here across the things that Caroline spoke about and Rose spoke about, and the others that exist think of Mopani worms, think of other bugs, just think of a landscape and all the possibilities. It's really challenging now how we can think about, how do we even look at something and see it as this kind of system that can produce this multiplicity of endeavors that support each other in producing those objectives. So I think this is a really good time to go over to Tariro, and ask you to try to help us to see this in the bigger picture, in the context of value chains, in the context of complex systems. Tariro. Tariro is with us. Oops. Okay, well, Tariro must have dropped off due to some kinds of difficulties. We will just have to come back to him when he comes in. Savannah, will you see if you can get hold of him, please?
Hello.
Oh, Tariro, you're there. Fantastic.
Yes.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much for bringing me to this exciting discussion. Okay, I would like to start to say that I'm a research fellow at the University of Cape Town, and also at the Stellenbosch University within this unit. So I'm very glad to be part of this very, very great discussion that has been going on. And thanks to the previous speakers for bringing in. I have got a background in issues relating to wildlife. So I'll try to bring in my angle through that background of mine, where I have studied a lot of issues relating to governance, particularly on private land in South Africa. So some of the background of it is that wildlife ranching actually became a very big industry, having started with the introduction of scientific knowledge in terms of management of both like integration of wildlife and domestic livestock. So you do see that there's a time, for instance, in Zimbabwe, some time long back during the colonial period, when there were some researchers who were invited from the United States, and they were actually asked to find out if it is possible to keep wildlife together with livestock. That was in Blue in the early 1960s. So their conclusion was that it is actually very possible to do that. And we're actually seeing that also happening with our recent experience when we were in Vikfors, when we were being taught about Shangani holistic. But that spared actually the development of the wildlife ranching sector, for instance, in South Africa. So at one time, for instance, in 2011, I attended the International Wildlife Ranching Symposium in Kimberley. One thing that struck me there was that alongside the conference, we had a lot of exhibitors who were actually supporting the conference, who had also like partly funded, they were sponsors. So you would find out that we had people who were from the taxidermy industry, people who were involved in game capture and translocation, people who were involved in production of supplemental feeding, and also the veterinary kind of services that are related to wildlife. And in its essence, you would see that that is a development of an industry where we do have some kind of value chain, because which is anchored on the production of game, mostly on private land. And it is something that when you look at it, for instance, also in the Zimbabwean context, you would see that Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, they do share a common kind of heritage in terms of this development of the wildlife ranching sector. And it is something that developed because there was also a realization that there is need to provide an enabling environment. So you do see that in the respective countries, there were some kinds of shifts in terms of providing the legal framework, which allows like the breeding of animals, the commercialization of the sector, as Rose has also indicated when you look at it from that perspective. So it is quite enchanting and also exciting that Zimbabwe is coming on board. Not necessarily that it was not something that was there. It was something that's there, but then you have got bits and pieces of certain things happening from here and there, which need to be sort of like coordinated. And we are now starting to see that there is some measures coming, proactive measures coming from government, where they start to bring the issue of nature and how to tap into it so that it can benefit the economy and also people as such. So you do see that there is need to, for instance, we look at this issue of the development of the Zimbabwe biodiversity economy status report in terms of wanting to harness these resources. They are actually mainly focused on trying to mainstream the value of nature so that it can be part of development planning and the policy implementation. And there is now need to also marry or actually connect the protection of the environment to how it can be utilized so that it can support some livelihoods. So you do see that we actually seeing here the Minister of Finance, for instance, starting to question and actually also wanting to work with the Minister of Environment, asking what is the value of nature and what is nature's contribution to Zimbabwe's GDP. In essence, in terms of my sort of, how can I say, conception of these issues as a Zimbabwean and also as someone who grew up in the rural areas, I would like to say that the wildlife economy is existing, but mostly it has been informal, okay, in the sense that we do have certain sectors of that economy which are not tapped formally so that you can actually see the the measures in terms of the quantity or the value in terms of maybe monetary value that can be said to be that which can be attributed to what is actually being obtained from nature except when we look at benefits related to agriculture, where we use the national resources, but in a way in which we actually produce our own food and various kinds of products. So you will see that there is actually need to tap into the informal economy, which is already existing. I'll try to give some of the examples because some of them actually really apply to me when I look at the way how I grew up in the rural areas. So one of those things is that we need to look at the appropriation of resources in terms of access. Where are the resources and how can those resources be tapped into? There are already existing structures in terms of how some of those resources have been benefiting the country. So we actually, Victor, for instance, talked about the state protected areas and how some of those resources, for instance, relating to tourism, benefit the economy. We do have the figures, for instance, in terms of the people who come to view some of our nature-based sort of tourist attractions. And then we do have land that is communal land. Mostly you see that in terms of conservation, we have a very successful story of community-based natural resources management under the Campfire program, for instance. And that was a way in which people were protecting nature, but also benefiting from it as a collective. Because when they allow people to come, visitors to come in and hunt, and some of the revenues are benefiting them, it is something where they directly benefit because they can actually see some of those processes that are coming from that kind of resource. We also have the private land, and in Zimbabwe we also have the conservancies. But the conservancy movement, some that started in KZN under Nick Steele. When we look at the development of the wildlife ranching sector, it is something that has been so much benefiting the country in terms of the revenues that come through people who actually visit those conservancies, and also the management processes that are effected there, which are also sort of like encapsulate some of the scientific principles of management or actually a conservation of nature, which has benefited the country. But then we must not also shy away from some of the controversies or some of the issues that have affected us as a country, particularly which we look at when relating to the land reform program. And one of those things that happened, for instance, I worked for one of the little organizations which involved in dissemination of information relating to the legal procurement of in fact, when we look at the issues of poaching, illegal wildlife trade, you do see there are a lot of court cases where people have been arrested for poaching, so-called poaching, or actually possessing specimens of animals that are not allowed, or they don't have permits for moving wildlife. And it's one of those issues where there is need to clear some ground so that whatever is happening in that sector, people can actually be able to know what they are supposed to do and not allowed to do. So we do have a lot of cases where people have been arrested because they've actually breached the law, and you know, but they always like argue that these are some of the resources that we are very close to us, and in terms of human wildlife conflict, they also say they're justified. But we also need to see that those issues actually are also ironed out. And then when we look at the informal economy, for instance, like I was saying, for instance, I can also agree with some of the things that Caroline has said when we look at the issues of plants. Most of the medicines that people use when they are actually affected by various ailments, particularly in the countryside, where they can be very far away from medical facilities, they easily resort to traditional medicine. And I think that is also an area where there is potential for bioprospecting, for commercialization, or actually harnessing some of the medicines that come from nature. And in Zimbabwe, we do have these issues which relate to, I think when we talk about the wildlife economy here, we also have to not only talk in terms of the economy, in terms of the monetary value, but also looking at the social and cultural aspects of it. Because we do have structures in the rural areas, like even in the country. We do have the organization, for instance, of traditional healers, the Zimbabwe National Traditional Healers Association. They have got mechanisms in which they accredit themselves and so on, so that they can be able to tap into the ways in which they can actually make use of some of the natural resources, particularly when you look at plants and even animals. So we need to tap into, besides the scientific management of natural resources that we have managed to harness, so that we have become a conservation success story when it comes to our natural resources. We also need to actually connect that to indigenous knowledge systems, because there's some aspect of stereotyping, okay, of traditional and kind of modern medicine. And that is an area in which the country could also benefit, because we do have some kind of species of plants that provide medicinal benefits, but they are not commercialized because people have got some kind of stereotype which they associate themselves with, and not able to want to come out. But then we know that that market exists and is just not being recognized. So growing up in the rural areas, for instance, you do see that we used to eat quite a lot of edible insects. Right now, we do have the baobab fruit. It's actually being harnessed, and people actually making money out of it, because the baobab fruit is very nutritious and is now being pegged and being sold within the country and also overseas. So that's an area in which the wildlife economy can also, when you look at how some of these natural resources can actually be tapped. We do have some of the researches that have been done at the Chinhoyi University. I think there's a lady there, Mansera, who has discussed how some edible insects, various kinds of edible insects can be tapped into, of which one of them, which has always been there, is been the mopani worm, which is very prominent. But then we do have several others in the rural areas, I mean the countryside, and they need to be tapped into as well. Look at the beekeeping sector, for instance. People, I mean, they are benefiting quite a lot because of the status of our economy, like I was saying, that is mostly informal. But then we do have issues where we do have, for instance, the beekeepers and their association, they produce honey and various kinds of products associated with that, which is benefiting because it is a sector which can be quantified in terms of how much they produce. And but we do have some gray areas there, as other people can also attest. But though in the rural areas, we do see that in terms of agriculture, for example, in my area where I grew up, people used to grow cotton and they spray, you know, with chemicals, and that has done a devastating effect in terms of killing some of these, destroying some of these insects which promote pollination, and also even like including the bees which produce honey for us. So you just see that it is very important to realize that the market, for instance, like I say, that's my takeaway point. The market, the wildlife market is existing, but for me, I think the economy is existing, but I think it's mostly informal. There is need to find ways in which we can popularize some of the products that we derive from nature and capitalize on them by providing a safe and conducive environment for people to be proud to be associated, because like I was saying, that here in Southern Africa, we have this common heritage in terms of massive resources that are available to us, but we just need to be able to tap into them. I think that is what I can say.
Right. Well, Tariro, thank you very much. Again, you've added a whole panoply of opportunities into our thinking. which is wonderful, even my favorite, the Mopani worms, and quite a few others. But you've also pointed to some of the complexities in really making this work, in driving forward a flourishing wildlife economy. You've referred and picked up some of the tensions that came up earlier, and also some of the challenges that are faced in trying to really develop markets for these products. And not only that, is really understanding where the enabling environment needs to be. So I want to just go back to looking at the conversation that's come up in the chat, and also some of the things that were raised sort of earlier on in the discussion, which is this interesting tension between agriculture and conservation, because it's come up a few times this afternoon in terms of, well, we sort of treat agriculture in one way and we treat wildlife products in a different way. It's almost as if we feel that the agricultural sector, which has long been a driver of the success of the Zimbabwean economy, has its act together in a way that we don't in wildlife economies, in that it has markets, it has processes, it has regulatory environments, it has, you know, international markets, etc., etc., etc. And yet, when we talk about wildlife products, we don't have all those things in place. And I wonder, Max Makavisa, are you possibly prepared to just step in here quickly and add a word or two of some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, Deborah, thanks a lot. I have a few words to say. I think, you know, when you talk about agriculture and wildlife as two separate things, we tend to see them as one. On the ranch, we have just shy of 8,000 cattle. But we also have a whole host of wildlife animals. You know, there's normally over 300 elephant. There are giraffe, kudu eland, impala, warthogs, sables, and the list goes on and on and on. And the way we do it is through integrating the two. And it's quite easy because we've taken down all our internal fences. So the animals roam freely, whether it be the wildlife or the cattle, although the cattle have herders as opposed to the wildlife. And we found that it's almost like a sanctuary type effect. And you have the wildlife numbers are greater where we are than in some of the surrounding areas. And I don't know if I can talk much to the actual economy of it. We've just started on this whole wildlife economies, obviously with you guys, and we've just had the taste of game up in Victoria Falls. And one of the things that came up quite clearly was there's a huge demand for this game meat. But on our side, we're also saying there's a lot more research that needs to be done because we don't want to put ourselves into a situation where we go overboard with our wildlife meat and we get to a point where we've depleted resources. The other thing which is really important is because of our lack of internal fences and low external fence, there's the issue of the communities and how do we get the communities involved? We've started talking to the communities in terms of livestock, in terms of cattle and training and how they can manage their cattle in a better manner. We're also talking to them about anti-poaching, and we've had some great successes with some of the communities surrounding us. You know, when you've got the poachers coming across to try and get in and poach impala, et cetera, and the communities are now turning back the poachers. But we've still got to get to a way where we've got to incorporate the communities in the business of the wildlife economy, because the reality is we do not have enough private game farms, for want of a better expression, and the majority of the animals roam freely, and we have to get the communal farmers or the communities around us, the smallholders, involved in the system. And that's something we're working on, obviously, with AWEI and with our research and conservation department.
This is fascinating.
I don't know if I've answered the question.
No, I think you've just raised more questions than you've answered, but that's what this kind of dialogue is for, right?
Sorry, I have a habit of doing that.
No, but this is what we're here for. We're here to try and understand what are the research gaps, what are the things we need to try to find out, what are the things we need to research, what are the things we have to experiment with, like at the ranch and in other places. Rose, could I possibly ask you to step back in here a minute? So we've now talked about this tension between agriculture and conservation of the wildlife economy. Max is at the coalface of trying to farm both these things at once in a ranch. We've seen that you know, Peter has raised some concerns about in the chat about where is wildlife ranching just farming and not having conservation value. And yet we know that in wildlife ranching, there is a lot of possibility for sort of multiple benefits that clearly people can come there, as Max says, and we can, you know, and have tourism as well as the sort of meat value of the wildlife ranching. But what you haven't addressed, Rose, and I don't know if you can, is how you also conceive of community engagement. So can you see how this can all fit together, Rose?
Thank you so much, Deborah, for your question. And thank you to my co-panelists on highlighting some key issues to do with wildlife. Your question is on the involvement of communities. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you know, as a country, we are talking about how do we get the communities to be part of the stockholders? How do we get them as the stakeholders? And I'm happy to share that as the government, we are promoting the community conservancies. And in these community conservancies, I'm sure you all know about the campfire, where we have people who were where we have communal land, where locals were benefiting through hunting. And with the challenges that are ongoing at the moment, we've realized that there is now need to create conservancies. This is a community-owned project. Already we are working with the Hwange. I'll give you an example of the Hwange Road District Council. They have an area that they set aside for the communities. Through funding from partners, we have the Sidinda community area. And how we've done that is there's an area that was set aside by the communities, and through funding from partners, we managed to stock this area with wildlife. And this area is supposed to be owned by the communities. So the communities have their rangers, they have people who are trained by the Parks and Wildlife on how to manage this game. And we also go in with the technical advice on how to look after this wildlife and how they can also benefit from wildlife. We have other areas where we are trying to work with the communities, like in the Binga area, the Mount Darwin area, and even the Gurve area. So we are now moving away from these big managed areas, like the campfire areas, and we are now creating areas where these areas are going to be extensively or intensively managed. These areas are going to be set aside for wildlife, and they have their ecotourism projects. They do game drives in these areas, and they can also build lodges where people can come in with their facilities, people come in, they sleep, and also they get to experience the wildlife. I just want to touch on the issue of mixed ranching. Mixed ranching is something that we are also promoting. These are areas where when someone has got their piece of land, they have their livestock, they have their cattle, they have their goats, and they also have the plains game. And the plains game is mostly the impala, the zebras, the kudus, and the eland. So it's something that we are also promoting. When someone has got their piece of land, they are interested in wildlife, we go in, we do an assessment, and we give them the necessary paperwork to capture and translocate, and also get to keep the game. So most people are coming in to keep the game for ecotourism projects, and some are also coming in to have wildlife on their properties, and they also cull this wildlife for meat. So these are some of the possible opportunities that we are also promoting. And we are not separating wildlife ranching and wildlife conservation. While we have wildlife conservation management in our state protected areas, we are also conserving wildlife on the private farms. Thank you so much, Deborah. I hope I've managed to answer your question.
Oh, absolutely, thanks. I think my issue is, have you answered Peter's question? I think, though, that Peter, you're right. There's no such thing as pure conservation. But I think Rose has very nicely sketched this kind of positive interaction complex system scenario where things support each other. Do you want to make a brief intervention? Peter Mills.
Hi, yes. Yeah, I just made a little note that the wildlife economy is very new on the block, and agriculture has taken, you know, thousands of years to develop into a production focused market. But my real issue is really around, and that's the thing with agriculture and with conservation, is the lowest common denominator is genetics. And the mixing of genetics in agriculture and the mixing of genetics in wildlife have two very different connotations. And sometimes we use the word conservation loosely and not in the way it should be used. And I just want to use South Africa as an example. We've got a very big and very vibrant wildlife game ranching system, but if you analyze that, it's absolutely not conservation. Its objectives are sometimes nefarious to conservation, in that there's been intensive breeding, which has absolutely no conservation value whatsoever. But it's created a market. Now that is not conservation. The intensive breeding industry has yielded very little in terms of ancillary benefits to conservation, although the bigger game farms have. They might have they don't have ecological objectives, they have economic objectives. And so but the farm is under wildlife, and the other species benefit from that. And I don't know if any of you heard of the new classification of land uses by the IUCN called other effective area-based conservation measures, which is a new category which identifies activities that aren't conservation, but that have a positive conservation spin. And that's what game ranching is. And I don't think people think enough about the distinction between what they're doing as conservation and what they're doing under the wildlife economy. And sometimes we in the wildlife economy, we must be careful not to break, and I think that's the difference between agriculture and the wildlife economy. Is our foundation is ecological principles that guide those decisions. There's a big overlap, and we really need to work on it. I'm not saying it's one or the other, but we really need to work on that overlap between the domestication of species and the persistence of wild species.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. You're just pointing to, yet again, as so many people have in so many different ways this afternoon, is coming into the complexity of the system that we're working with, and that nothing is black or white. It is somewhere in the gray, and it's a question of how we maximize at any given time the multiple objectives we're trying to get to. Yeah. We're also, and I think,
sorry, Deborah, can
yes.
I just say, and we need space for that dialogue. And I made a comment right in the beginning about about interference from outside, and that comes, and I actually feel very strongly about this. The outside interference is with all their money and with an ideology that doesn't fit an African ideology, is not allowing us space for that dialogue. And we've got to have that dialogue now in an open and open space.
It's like Victor said in the beginning, we need these candid conversations. And you're absolutely right. This is a time at which the countries of Africa need to assert their independence in a new and different way. And that includes owning what happens and owning the discussion and owning where it goes. But I just want to go back, thank you, Peter, to just what, because we've running out of time quite fast here, is to a couple points that have come up again in the discussion as well, and Joan mentioned it as well. But the question really is how we actually take the elements of this wildlife economy and try to add the maximum amount of value to it, so that while we're satisfying all these objectives, we're maximizing the economic value. And this is back to, I'd like to ask Caroline if she could possibly give us an example as well, Caroline, thinking about the wild plant opportunities that bioinnovation is generating. You look at you talked about a lot of industries that are really, well, it's the cosmetic industry. By the time you buy the product to put it on your face, it's had a lot of beneficiation along the way. How do you see how we can possibly within country maximize the parts of the value chain that our communities and our enterprises can benefit from? Caroline.
I think it'll just require a lot of support, support by government, support by the industry themselves, support by donors. That's the only way I can see us sort of moving up the value chain, because that's a little bit the issue definitely we have in Zimbabwe at the moment, that we are mostly producing and exporting raw materials, and yeah, like I said, I think it's where every sort of industry starts, and then I think if then we don't get injections of big funds from government, from industry, from donors, we get stuck a little bit. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a challenge there though, because we just talked a little bit, and Peter raised this issue about really we have to own this. We have to own these processes. But by being dependent on funds from people all over the world, then you sort of like, you're in the dependency trap to some degree. So there's a bit of a question about how can we create an environment where we can develop these markets, where we can actually maybe, if we think about the enabling environment, how we could explore a bit further as to how we could make that more feasible to attract investment and build markets effectively. What does it take? What are the kinds of policy evolutions we need? What are the kinds of international trade agreements that we need, for example? So I think there's more to think about there too. And I think there's also more to think about in something that Tariro raised, which is about the social and cultural aspects and using traditional knowledge to build brands and things like that. Peter said, can we hear from Sue? Yes, of course we can hear from Sue. Sue, is there anything you wanted to add? Because we're down to the last few minutes here.
Thanks, Deborah. Hi, Peter. It's been a while. Yeah, I mean, the discussion has been very, very interesting. Thank you to all the presenters. And I mean, I think, yeah, certainly the research we do in the issues are pretty much the same in most countries, and consistently so, about creating an enabling environment, encouraging investment. Wildlife economy, what's critical is the ease of doing business. If you want to encourage private sector investment, which is what we need to avoid the dependency, so that we create an economy. It's all very well talking about a wildlife economy, but you have to create that economy through investment and through enabling investment. And so, yeah, we are working on this Wildlife Economy Investment Index. I've just been working with the statistician this morning, actually, and it's really exciting. But looking at that, countries, where are they at in terms of that enabling environment, that ease of doing business, and then, their asset and how they're managing it. Hopefully will provide some guidance to countries on that. But critical, I think it was Peter that mentioned the community engagement. It's, I mean, that is my passion and how they can engage in benefits. So yeah, exciting to see the agreement on that, but it is critical. And I do think Zimbabwe has huge potential and already has the framework. A lot of the legislation is in place. And so now it is just about, for me, the ease of doing business and enabling environment for private sector investment now. And a lot of that has to do with political stability and instability in this case. That is why a lot of the private sector don't invest. But yeah, really interesting discussions. Thank you very much for putting this webinar together, Deborah and the AWEI team.
Well, thanks, Sue. And you've really summed it up, I think, from the perspective of the enabling environment, what it needs. I'm going to now just switch for the final last word before I close to Mike, another AWEI fellow, Michael Tasrolf, because you said something here about conservation being a mindset, Mike. This is about now, we've heard from Sue about the enabling environment. How do we think about grounding what we do in a conservation sense, Mike?
Thanks, Deborah. Okay, you put me on the spot here. But yeah, I would just argue that there are conservation principles. And they speak to operating a wildlife economy in a sustainable context. Conservation, as originally defined, was the wise use of natural resources, as opposed to preservation. So it's really a case of integrating our practices into the ecological principles that Peter spoke about. But I think those principles can be applied across the board. Not just, let's say, within protected areas. They can be applied in agricultural contexts. They can even be applied in intensive management contexts, as long as you're seeing the bigger picture and managing according to the bigger picture. So that would be my position.
Thanks, Mike. Well, you know, really, there's been such a rich discussion, both in the chat, and I'd love to pick up the issue, Bruce, of the agricultural subsidies, but we really don't have more time this afternoon. And I just want to say thank you so much to everybody for participating. This has raised so many more questions than it's answered, not just you, Max, but everybody. And we really look forward to taking this forward. Please feel free to email us, get in touch. If we send you the sort of follow-up survey, write there what you think. We really want to take this forward. Thank you, everybody, so much for participating today, and we'll be in touch again soon. Thank you. And goodbye.